There comes a point in every person's life when you must confront a difficult truth. The greatest obstacle to your future may not be your circumstances, your environment, or even the people around you. Sometimes, the greatest obstacle is the version of yourself that has become comfortable with where you are. And this is why growth requires intention. You cannot build a new life with an old mindset. You cannot enter a new season while continuously making decisions from the fears, assumptions, habits, and limitations of the previous season. At some point, you have to recognize that what once protected you may now be restricting you. Think about that carefully. There are habits you developed because they helped you survive a certain period. There are attitudes you adopted because you were disappointed. There are walls you built because somebody hurt you. There are excuses you learned because failure became frightening. There are places you stopped going because you convinced yourself that you did not belong there. But survival mechanisms can become permanent limitations when you refuse to examine them. This is why personal growth begins with awareness. Before you can change your behavior, you must become conscious of the thinking that produces that behavior. Your actions are often the visible expression of invisible beliefs. If you believe you are incapable, you will behave cautiously. If you believe you are unworthy, you will tolerate relationships and environments that diminish you. If you believe failure defines you, you will avoid opportunities that require courage. If you believe your snort's past determines your future, you will keep repeating yesterday while expecting tomorrow to be different. And that is one of the greatest psychological traps of human beings. We often become loyal to identities that were never designed. Why personal growth requires change to last? You say, that's just who I am. But who told you that? Who told you that your personality cannot mature?
Who told you that your habits cannot change? Who told you that because you were once insecure, you must remain insecure? Who told you that because you failed before, you must continue to live like a failure? Your history may explain you, but it does not have the authority to permanently define you. There is a difference between knowing yourself and imprisoning yourself inside an old description of yourself. Growth requires you to challenge the language you use about your own life. Stop saying, "I have always been this way," as though your past is a prophecy. Stop saying, "I can't change," when what you really mean is, "I have not yet developed the discipline to change." Those are not the same thing. You must learn to separate your identity from your current condition. You may be struggling, but struggle is not your identity. You may have failed, but failure is not your identity. You may have made terrible decisions, but your worst decisions does not have to become your permanent definition. A mature person understands that identity is not merely something you inherit from your past. It is something you continuously develop through choices. That means you have responsibility, and responsibility is powerful because it gives you back control. When you blame everything outside yourself, you surrender your power. But when you say, "There are things I must change in me," you have entered the territory of transformation. This does not mean you are responsible for everything that happened to you. You are not. But you are responsible for what you do with what happened to you. That distinction can change your life. You cannot rewrite yesterday, but you can refuse to allow yesterday to write tomorrow. And sometimes outgrowing yourself means becoming honest about what no longer belongs in your life. The friendships that constantly pull you. Stop living in your past backward. The routines that consume your time without producing anything meaningful. The emotional reactions that destroy opportunities.
The need to explain yourself to everybody. The addiction to approval. The habit of procrastinating until your potential becomes frustrated with you. You must ask yourself difficult questions. What am I tolerating that is keeping me small? What behavior do I repeatedly defend even though I know it is damaging me? What fear have I mistaken for wisdom? What comfort have I mistaken for peace? What limitation have I accepted simply because I have lived with it for so long? Those questions are uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that something is being exposed. Growth often begins where your excuses end. And understand this. Forcing yourself to outgrow your old version does not mean becoming someone artificial. It means becoming more intentional about who you were designed to become. You don't have to become somebody else. You have to become a more developed version of yourself. The disciplined version, the courageous version, the focused version, the emotionally mature version, the version that no longer needs every person to approve of the decisions necessary for your future, because eventually you must stop asking what will people think if I change and start asking what will my life become if I refuse to change. That is the question. Your future is being shaped by what you repeatedly choose today. Every decision is casting a vote for the person you are becoming, so choose carefully. If the old version of you was easily distracted, become focused. If the old version was controlled by emotion, develop emotional discipline. If the old version constantly sought validation, develop internal conviction. If the old version ran from responsibility, learn to embrace it. If the old version quit when things became difficult, develop endurance, because the next level of your life will not be sustained by the danger of an outdated mindset, the old level of your character. You must grow into what you are asking life to give you. Clears throat. And remember this, your future does not need a perfect version of you. It needs a willing version of you, willing to learn, willing to change, willing to confront yourself, and willing to become greater than you were yesterday. Do not be afraid to outgrow who you were. Be afraid of becoming comfortable with who you could have become. Now, once you become aware that your old version is limiting your future, the next challenge is discipline, because awareness without action produces nothing. You can know exactly what needs to change and still remain exactly where you are. And this is where many people become frustrated with themselves. They know what they should do, but they don't do it consistently. They know the habit is damaging them, but they keep returning to it. They know they need to become more focused, but they continue giving their attention to everything that demands it. They know they need to move forward, but they keep negotiating with the same fears that have held them back for years. Why? Because knowing is intellectual, but changing is behavioral. Your mind may understand the destination, while your habits continue taking you in the opposite direction. You must understand that your life is largely shaped by what you repeatedly do, not merely by what you occasionally desire. A powerful dream means very little. If your daily behavior is incompatible with that dream, you cannot say you want a disciplined life while consistently obeying every impulse. You cannot say you want peace while constantly entertaining unnecessary conflict. You cannot say you want growth while protecting the habits that keep you comfortable. You cannot say you want a different future while repeatedly practicing the behavior of your past. This is why discipline is not punishment. Discipline is alignment. It is the ability to make today's behavior agree with tomorrow's vision. And sometimes that requires you to force yourself. You will not always force yourself beyond your comfort zone. Feel motivated to wake up early. You will not always feel like studying, working, exercising, praying, building, or learning. Do it anyway. You will not always feel inspired to remain silent when somebody provokes you. Remain silent anyway. You will not always feel confident enough to take the next step. Take it anyway, because if you make your emotions the authority over your decisions, your life will constantly change direction. Emotions are real, but emotions are not always reliable leaders. You can feel afraid and still move forward. You can feel tired and still remain committed. You can feel uncertain and still make a wise decision. You can feel discouraged and still refuse to quit. That is maturity. Maturity is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to prevent temporary emotion from controlling permanent decisions. And this is where you begin to outgrow your old self. The old version of you asks, do I feel like doing this? The growing version asks, does this need to be done? That is a profound difference. One lives according to convenience, the other lives according to conviction, and you need to understand that every time you keep a promise to yourself, you strengthen your identity. Every time you say you are going to do something and then actually do it, you build self-rust. But every time you repeatedly break promises to yourself, you teach your mind that your own commitments cannot be trusted. That is why discipline is psychological before it becomes practical. You are training your mind to understand that your decisions have authority over your impulses. You are telling yourself, I am capable of directing my life. That produces confidence, not the superficial confidence that comes from applause, but the deeper confidence that comes from knowing you can depend on yourself. And perhaps this is why small disciplines matter so much. People often wait for dramatic moments to transform their lives. But transformation is usually hidden inside ordinary decisions. Getting up when you said you would, finishing what you started, turning off the distraction, saying no when necessary, saving instead of wasting. Discipline, when motivation disappears, learning instead of complaining, working when nobody's watching, keeping your word when nobody can reward you. These decisions may appear insignificant, but they are constructing your character. Character is not created in one dramatic moment. It is accumulated through repeated choices, and you must be careful about what you repeatedly tolerate, because tolerance eventually becomes training. If you repeatedly tolerate procrastination, you train yourself to delay. If you repeatedly tolerate negative thinking, you train yourself to interpret life through negativity. If you repeatedly tolerate disrespect, you may eventually convince yourself that disrespect is normal. If you repeatedly abandon your goals whenever difficulty appears, you train yourself to associate discomfort with quitting. But the opposite is also true. When you repeatedly choose discipline, discipline becomes easier. When you repeatedly choose courage, courage becomes familiar. When you repeatedly choose focus, distraction loses some of its power. When you repeatedly choose growth, stagnation becomes uncomfortable. That is how you create a new version of yourself, not by waiting for a new personality to arrive, but by repeatedly practicing new behaviors until they become part of your character. And don't misunderstand the word force. Forcing yourself to grow does not mean abusing yourself. It means refusing to allow temporary resistance to become permanent limitation. There will always be resistance. The mind likes familiarity. The ego likes comfort. The body often prefers convenience, but your purpose may demand something greater than what is comfortable. You cannot always negotiate with your potential. Sometimes you have to say, I don't feel ready, but I will prepare. I don't feel strong, but I will become stronger. I don't feel confident, but I will take the step. That is how transformation happens, and eventually what once required force begins to become normal. The early morning becomes normal. The discipline becomes normal. The focus becomes normal. The boundaries become normal. The courage becomes normal. You are no longer forcing yourself to become disciplined, because discipline has become part of who you let go of limiting beliefs are. That is the goal, not temporary motivation, but permanent transformation. So stop waiting until you feel different before you behave differently. Sometimes you behave differently first, and eventually you begin to feel different. You don't discover your new self by thinking about becoming better. You discover your new self by repeatedly doing what your old self refused to do. But there is another dimension to outgrowing yourself that many people overlook. You can change your habits and still remain mentally trapped in the same identity. You can become more disciplined and still carry the same fears. You can change your environment and still reproduce the same patterns. That is why you must learn to outgrow your emotional attachment to your past. Your past has information, but it should not have ownership. Many people are not physically living in yesterday, but psychologically they are still there. They keep replaying what somebody said, what somebody did, what they lost, where they failed, snorts, who rejected them, what opportunity disappeared, or how life should have turned out. And the danger is that repeated reflection can become emotional residence. You visit the past so often that eventually you begin building your identity around it. You say, I am this way because of what happened to me. Maybe that is true to a certain degree. But the deeper question is, how long will what happened to you continue controlling what happens through you? You cannot change the event, but you can change its meaning. You cannot erase the disappointment, but you can refuse to let disappointment become your personality. You cannot undo betrayal, but you can decide that betrayal will not make you incapable of trust, wisdom, or healthy relationships. You cannot recover every opportunity you lost, but you can stop wasting the opportunities that remain. This is what psychological maturity looks like. It is the ability to acknowledge your history without becoming imprisoned by it. And sometimes you have to forgive, not because what happened was acceptable, but because carrying it forever gives the past continued authority over your present. Become the person your future requires. Forgiveness is not pretending that nothing happened. Forgiveness is refusing to allow the injury to become the architect of your identity. There are people who have left your life physically but still occupy enormous psychological space. You are still arguing with them in your mind, still trying to prove something to them, still imagining what they would think if they saw you succeed. But listen carefully. You cannot build your future while constantly performing for people who belong to your past. At some point, you must stop trying to prove yourself and start developing yourself. The goal is not to make your old enemies regret underestimating you. The goal is to become so internally secure that their opinion no longer determines your direction. That is freedom, and freedom requires emotional detachment from old identities. Maybe you were once the person who was overlooked. Maybe you were once the person who failed. Maybe you were once the person who made terrible decisions. Maybe you were once the person who lacked confidence. But once is a powerful word. It reminds you that time has moved. You are not obligated to remain loyal to an identity simply because it has been familiar. People often say, that's just how I am, when what they really mean is, that's how I have learned to operate. Those are two completely different statements. Learned behavior can be unlearned. Old assumptions can be challenged. Emotional reactions can be examined. Pasts can be interrupted. And identities can mature. This is why you must become intentional about the story you tell yourself. If you constantly tell yourself that you're unlucky, you will begin searching for evidence of misfortune. If you constantly tell yourself that nobody can be trusted, you will interpret every relationship through suspicion. If you constantly tell yourself that you're not capable, you will avoid situations that could prove you wrong. The mind tends to look for confirmation of the beliefs it already holds. So, if you want a different life, you must sometimes challenge the narrative that has been running inside your mind for years. Ask yourself, stop making excuses for your old habits. Is this actually true, or is this simply what I have become accustomed to believing? That question can create a breakthrough, because sometimes the prison has no physical walls. The prison is the belief that you cannot become anything different, and your responsibility is to challenge that belief. You must give yourself permission to become unfamiliar. Some people will not understand your growth because they only know your history. They remember the person you were when you had less wisdom, less discipline, less confidence, and less clarity. But you are not required to remain the person they remember. Growth changes your vocabulary. Growth changes your priorities. Growth changes your relationships. Growth changes what you tolerate. Growth changes what you pursue. And yes, growth may change who has access to you. That does not make you arrogant. It means you have finally understood that access to your life is a responsibility, not an entitlement. You cannot carry everybody into every season. Some relationships belong to your past because they were connected to a version of you that no longer exists, and you must learn the difference between losing people and losing yourself. Sometimes letting go is not abandonment. Sometimes letting go is alignment. You are not called to spend your entire life explaining your transformation to people committed to misunderstanding it. Keep growing. Let your life become the explanation, and understand something else. Outgrowing yourself requires humility. You must be willing to admit that some of your previous beliefs were wrong, some decisions were immature, some reactions were unnecessary, some relationships were unhealthy, some ambitions were based on comparison rather than purpose. And that admission does not diminish you, it develops you. A wise person is not someone who has never been wrong. A wise person is someone who can recognize when they are wrong and have enough courage to change. So don't defend an old version of yourself simply because you spent years becoming that person. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to learn. You are allowed to change your mind when you gain new understanding. You are allowed to become healthier, wiser, stronger, protect your purpose and vision, calmer and more purposeful. Your past deserves acknowledgement, but your future deserves obedience.
You have spent enough time explaining why you became who you were. Now spend your energy becoming who you are capable of becoming, because the purpose of remembering your past is not to live there. Your past should be a reference point, not a residence. And now we arrive at perhaps the most important part of this journey. You must stop waiting for your future to give you permission to become the person capable of carrying it, because growth is ultimately about responsibility. There is a version of you that can handle more, create more, influence more, serve more, and accomplish more. But that version cannot be built through wishful thinking. It must be developed intentionally. You cannot keep asking for a bigger life while refusing to become bigger internally. A greater opportunity requires greater capacity.
A greater responsibility requires greater character. A greater level of influence requires greater emotional maturity. And this is where many people misunderstand success. They want the results of growth without submitting themselves to the process that produces growth. They want the position without the preparation. They want the recognition without the discipline. They want the harvest without becoming the person capable of managing the harvest. But life will eventually expose the difference between desire and capacity. You may receive an opportunity, but if your character cannot sustain it, the opportunity can become a burden. You may receive money, but if you have not developed wisdom, money can magnify your weaknesses. You may receive influence, but if you have not developed humility, influence can corrupt your judgment. You may receive freedom, but if you have not developed discipline, freedom can become another form of destruction. This is why you must prepare yourself for the future before the future arrives. Ask yourself, what kind of person must I become to handle the life I say I want? Growth requires sacrifice. That question changes everything. If you want leadership, become responsible before anyone gives you authority. If you want peace, learn how to govern your emotions. If you want meaningful relationships, become someone capable of communicating, listening, forgiving, and establishing healthy boundaries. If you want success, develop the discipline to continue working when immediate results are absent. If you want purpose, stop allowing distractions to consume the time required to pursue it. Your future is not simply waiting for you. In many ways, your future is demanding preparation from you, and preparation often feels invisible. Nobody applauds you for saying no to a distraction. Nobody celebrates the private decision to wake up and work when you could have stayed comfortable. Nobody sees the internal battle when you choose discipline over impulse. But those invisible decisions are constructing the visible future. Character is built privately before it is demonstrated publicly. That is why you cannot measure your progress only by what people can see. Maybe you haven't reached the destination yet. Maybe the salts are still small. Maybe nobody recognizes the changes happening inside you. Keep going. Because sometimes the most important growth is happening beneath the surface. A tree does not become strong because people admire its branches. It becomes strong because its roots grow deep. Your life is the same. You need roots before you need recognition. You need substance before you need status. You need character before you need influence. And this requires patience. One of the greatest enemies of personal development is the desire for immediate transformation. We live in a culture that wants instant results, instant recognition, instant success, instant answers. But meaningful growth is usually gradual. You don't become emotionally mature in one conversation. You don't become disciplined in one morning. You don't develop wisdom, build your new identity through one experience. You become different through repeated encounters with responsibility, failure, refill reflection, correction, and deliberate action. That is why you must stop despising small progress. Every time you make a better decision than you would have made 6 months ago, you are changing. Every time you respond with wisdom instead of anger, you are changing. Every time you remain committed instead of quitting, you are changing. Every time you choose purpose over temporary pleasure, you are changing. Every time you refuse to return to an old pattern, you are changing. Never underestimate the power of repetition. The person you become tomorrow is being constructed by what you repeatedly practice today. And eventually the new behavior becomes a new standard. The new standard becomes a new character. And the new character creates a new life. But there is another responsibility that comes with growth. You must stop comparing your journey with everyone else's. Comparison is one of the fastest ways to lose focus. You cannot become your best self while constantly measuring yourself against someone else's timeline. Their chapter is not your chapter. Their resources are not your resources. Their background is not your background. Their assignment is not your assignment. Your responsibility is to maximize what has been placed in your hands. Ask yourself, am I becoming better than I was? That is the comparison that matters, not whether you are ahead of somebody, final, powerful messengers, not whether somebody else has achieved more, not whether someone else is receiving attention. Your real competition is the version of yourself that is still trying to keep you comfortable. And sometimes you have to disappoint that version. You have to say no to the old appetite, no to the old excuse, no to the old fear, no to the old environment, no to the old identity. Because every yes to your purpose will require a no to something that competes with it. That is the price of transformation. And when you finally understand this, you stop seeing discipline as restriction. You begin seeing discipline as protection. You stop seeing boundaries as rejection. You begin seeing boundaries as stewardship. You stop seeing change as loss. You begin seeing change as preparation. You realize that outgrowing yourself is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming progressively more aligned with the person you were meant to be. So don't wait for a crisis to force you to change. Don't wait until life breaks the old version of you. Choose to outgrow yourself while you still have the opportunity. Become stronger before the responsibility arrives. Become wiser before the decision arrives. And become disciplined before the opportunity arrives. Become prepared before the door opens. Because when the right opportunity finally appears, you don't want to be asking. You want your preparation to answer for you. You want your character to say yes. You want your discipline to say yes. You want your courage to say yes. You want your growth to say yes. And when you reach that point, you will realize something profound. The greatest achievement was never simply getting the new life. The greatest achievement was becoming the new person capable of living.